Hello, trading friends, and welcome back to Forex Focus, brought to you by IG. Taking a look today at the Japanese yen in light of what's been a rough couple of months, rough start to 2024 for the yen, and what's been pretty much a rough start to the decade for the yen. Of the major currencies that we look at, absolutely some of the worst performance that we've seen out of this yen, and we're going to size it up according to dollar, pound, and franc, some of the stronger currencies, and see where we're at historically with this recent price action, but also over the last 3 or so years. And then also take a look at the current client sentiment around these pairs to see if traders are on the long side or short side of this yen as it gets back to historic lows. But let's start with that dollar yen piece, because no matter how you slice it, it's been a rough one for yen. Obviously a solid couple of years for dollar, but you talk about over the course of 3-4 years here, 40% appreciation for this dollar over yen, and in major currency pair markets like dollar yen or euro dollar or sterling, whatever you want to cite here, a normal volatility on an annual basis is anywhere between 5 and usually 10-12%. And some of the higher volatility years, maybe 15%. Of course, volatility can go wherever, but that's what you usually see historically. And what does that tell you? Well, that tells you on an annual basis that those major pairs, the market projects that those major pairs would move plus or minus 5 to 10 or 12%. On bigger years, like I say, maybe 15% and higher. 37.8% in a few years span is, I mean, one, you're seeing some huge annual moves much outside of that 5 to 10% normal range. And two, they've kind of been stacked on top of each other. It's not been, dollar up 10% in 2021 and then dollar down 10% in 2022. It's been a lot of upside for dollar, downside for yen, and currently just a couple hundred pips away from 30-year lows for that Japanese yen, high for dollar around 150, 150, which we saw in recent trading. Now let's take a look at the client sentiment around this pair, and you can see 74%, almost 3 out of every 4 traders on the short side of dollar, long side of yen, probably looking for some historical mean reversion that we have seen in the past in currencies. Is you'll see a big move in one direction or the other, and then maybe the market will come back to its more historical mean, historical average. You'll remember euro dollar got down to parity for the first time in many, many years, and then euro bounced back to 105, 110 in that range. Now, we haven't seen that so much with Japanese yen, still near those extremes, and you have traders on the side of long yen, short dollar, but we'll see where the market actually goes. Obviously, no indication of where the market has to go. Just a majority of IG clients with positions in that market are short dollar, long yen. But let's take a look at the pound versus the yen, and you're going to see a similar trend over the long term, but different peaks and valleys as the pound has gotten beaten up at certain points as well. But you look at the last year or so of action, and that pound has actually been really strong against the yen, and it hasn't really let up, whereas the dollar has moved lower and then bounced back. The pound has been pretty consistently strong against this yen, but only up 31% since 2020. But right there at really historic highs for pound, low for yen in there as well. If you wanted to take the dollar piece out of it, and you had maybe a long or short bias on pound and you were looking for an extreme, if you were a trend follower, maybe looking for this to continue to the upside, if you were a contrarian looking for this to mean revert This is a nice cross that doesn't include the dollar. That's seeing a pretty similar extreme, but 31% versus the almost 40% from dollar yen. But you're going to see a pretty similar client sentiment on this one as well, which is short pound, long yen. And this is pretty much across the board with major currencies that have been beating up on the yen. IG clients with positions in those markets have tended to they're trying to catch that bounce maybe in that yen, looking for that historical mean reversion. Again, it doesn't mean that it has to happen, but 72% of traders with pound yen positions right now on the short side of that pound, long side of yen. Last one that I want to hit on here, just to solidify the case of yen being the weakest currency of the century or the decade, not necessarily, but pretty much probably the century so far as well, going back to 2000. Maybe we'll do some more data digging on that later. But this one's a real big extreme here. The Swiss franc versus the yen up more than 50% since 2020. Unreal move, especially, I mean, if you were to go back in time to the aughts or the 2010s or the 90s or whenever and say to a currency trader, you know, hey, what are some of the most stable currencies, some of the lower volatility currencies? The franc versus the dollar and the yen versus the dollar would probably be in their top 3 or 5. And you put these together in the last couple of years, and we've seen obviously some decent Swiss franc strength across the board, even against U.S. dollar, one of the only currencies that's been up against U.S. dollar in the last handful of years here. And you pair that with the weakness that the Japanese yen has seen against these other major currencies. And yeah, more than 50% since 2020. Absolutely unbelievable in there, and sitting right there at those highs for franc, lows for yen. And that's another extreme for the cross pairs if you wanted to take the US dollar out of it. And probably won't be surprised to see that client sentiment is 85% short. Maybe you're surprised by the heft of that number, but going with the trend of short major currency X, long yen, IG clients have tended to be with these pairs. But 85%, I mean, that's almost 9 out of every 10 traders with positions in this market on the short side of the Swiss franc, long side of yen, looking for that mean reversion. But right now, still sitting at that historic extreme. And just to close out today's show, maybe a little bit of why this is happening if you haven't been following the macroeconomic news of the last couple of years. This pretty much solidifies it. I mean, of course, there's so much else going on in Japan or in the US or in Switzerland or UK, wherever. But a lot of it comes down to the fact that Japanese interest rates have not been hiked at all in the same time that almost every major economy has hiked interest rates, as the economies globally have tended to bounce back really well. The US, the Euro area, the UK, Australia, Canada have bounced back really well post-pandemic, so well that inflation started to rise, and these economies, the central banks hiked interest rates, which can make their currencies a little bit more attractive to go invest at those higher interest rates. Japan have not hiked for the last several years, and not in the last couple that we were looking here, not this decade, that's to say. And so what you'd maybe be looking for on the reversal here, if yen were to get some bounce to it, might be either the Bank of Japan starting to hike interest rates like the other major economies, or you're seeing a lot of major economies, their central banks, looking at potential interest rate cuts. And so any way that they could close that gap and converge a little bit in economic data in general, but especially looking at the interest rates in these different regions, that could help Japan out of its recent slump, the weakest major currency of the decade. But that'll do it for today's segment. Thanks so much for watching. We'll continue to track this Japanese yen as it progresses here in 2024.